Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about the Cascadia subduction zone and the eventual earthquake that it'll create in the Pacific Northwest. My name's Lloyd Kimball. I'm with FEMA Region 10 in the Disaster Emergency Communications.
It's a Tuesday on the Oregon coast.
No,
This
hang
is the
on just a
tourist
second.
town of Seaside. It's a weekday, so the beaches are not nearly as packed as they would be on the weekend, but there's still
this
crowds.
video keeps wanting to self-start, and I got it talking in my ear. Okay. So I'm part of the FEMA integration team for Washington State. FEMA started a program where they are trying to embed FEMA employees in most of the state EOCs. A little over half the country has got FEMA folks working there. And so that way there's better coordination when events happen by having the state FEMA interface happening on a regular basis. I've been in that position since September of 2019, and for the 6 months prior to that, I was in Puerto Rico assisting with the Hurricane Maria recovery. Prior to that, I completed 18 deployments for the U.S. Antarctic program. I was working for contractors at all three U.S. Antarctic stations. My work there was as a satellite engineer and communications technician. Prior to that, I worked in public safety in Colorado as a 911 dispatch supervisor and a communications technician, and also in my past was involved in backcountry search and rescue and worked as a firefighter. And like a lot of folks here, I'm also a radio geek and a general class ham, N0NHJ. Couple disclaimers right up front. I might use some specific names of brands or service providers when I answer questions. If I do, it's purely for illustration and is strictly an example. Neither I nor the federal government ever endorse any particular system or brand, etc. Like most folks, my knowledge is limited. I'm certainly not I've never studied geology. I've only been with FEMA for a little over 2 years, so there's definitely a whole lot to the function that I have not been involved in. We'll be talking about this as a pretty high level. And one of the big things to keep in mind is FEMA and the federal government doesn't respond to disasters to take control. We're there to support the state and local and tribal authorities when disasters happen. Like the slide says, there's lots of preparation efforts happening throughout Region 10, and a lot of them will be in areas that I'm not familiar with. There's a lot of state planning that's going on. There's a lot of activities that have happened over the years, and there's just, it's amazing the amount of work that's going into the preparation for this. Please feel free to enter the questions as we move through the presentation. We'll be answering those at the end. For this evening, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the problem. Why do we care about the Cascadia subduction zone? Hopefully you'll understand why there's such a high level of concern. I'll try to provide an overview of the planning that's ongoing for a Cascadia event, and then we'll talk about where the amateur radio community fits in, and we'll talk real briefly about the exercise that's occurring next year. So let's start off with what it is. There's a really good video I'm going to switch to here, and it's only a couple minutes long, but it does an excellent job of understanding just the basics of it. So let me swap here. And I want this one and that one.
The Pacific Northwest is known for its towering trees, beautiful landscapes, and breathtaking coast. But it's what lies about 70 miles off that coast and anywhere from 300 to 10,000 feet below the ocean's surface that experts say we should really get to know. It's called the Cascadia subduction zone, a 620-mile-long fault that stretches from British Columbia to Northern California. It's where the Juan de Fuca plate is being slowly pushed into and underneath the North American plate. Right now, that zone is locked as the pressure builds daily. Geologists are well aware one day the pressure will be too much and that lock will break. When that happens, one plate will thrust below the other, generating one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded, a magnitude 9 or possibly even greater. The shaking will be felt for hundreds of miles from the coast all the way inland to Boise, even Sacramento. As one section of the ocean floor drops, so will the ocean water above it, creating a massive tsunami that will inundate low-lying coastal communities. It is a frightening scenario, and one geologists say could happen at any time. The last known Cascadia subduction zone megaquake struck in January of 1700, 319 years ago. Geological evidence shows these large quakes happen about every 250 years, which means really one could happen at any time. The problem, no one knows exactly when that time will come. But scientists are getting a better idea. They now believe there's a roughly 30% chance a destructive Cascadia quake will happen within the next 50 years. The question now, will communities be ready?
No, hang on.
Ever have to run out of battery power for your phone?
Sorry,
ever
I've
again,
got a
even if you're in
video
a dire
playing that I
situation.
definitely
And that's
don't
because
want to
I'm
hear.
holding
Okay. Yeah, that was the first part. There was part of a series that the TV network did a couple of years ago. Like you could tell this was from 2019 on earthquake readiness. The list of videos is in the handout that was attached to the information, and I'm sure Dan will include it in the other stuff. It's actually about a 40-minute presentation. You can watch the entire thing. Talks about faults around the country and a whole bunch of different activities related to that. So we watched that. One of the things that really strikes you when you think about it is they talk about a 30% chance of a Cascadia event in the next 50 years. Most predictions of earthquakes, they usually talk about the chances in the single digits and usually in much longer time frames. You know, they start talking about things reoccurring, you know, like there's a 5 or 10% chance over the next 200 years. So it's actually a pretty high possibility for us. So one of the things that you heard mentioned in there is how do they know that we're overdue for the Cascadia event? We're going to watch one more real short
beaches are not
video
nearly
clip.
as packed as they would be on the
Sorry, I keep having problems with the videos starting on their own. Uh-oh. There we go. Not sure if the audio is coming through. Hold on just a second.
Sure, the two boxes are checked on the bottom when you share.
Okay, yeah, I had that. I wasn't hearing the audio myself locally,
Right.
so I think it was a browser issue here. Let me reload the page here and see if I can get it to play. I think what I need to do, give me just a second here and pull it up from the slide.
Story to tell. If silence could speak. In this coastal forest in Washington state, there is a story to tell. And this place has a name, the Ghost Forest. And the peace here today masks the violence which struck here at 9 p.m. on January 26th of the year 1700. As the geological forces which created a great earthquake and tsunami in Japan just 8 years ago reminds us that even today, that threat remains to strike us on the west coast of the U.S. again. Jeff Oxos takes us up the Copalis River, not far from where it empties into the Pacific Ocean, where the roots of those trees extend on land that is being pushed higher by tectonic force. So what killed the ghost forest? It's very simple, a loss of elevation. So for hundreds of years, these trees were growing in largely a freshwater environment, but they weren't very high above sea level. So in the earthquake, the west coast of Washington state dropped more than 6 feet. This became a salt marsh, and the trees died. From the Copalis River on Washington's west coast to Discovery Bay on the state's north coast, where geography captures wave energy. Geologists can track the history of great earthquakes and tsunamis. Chopping away at a mud bank, Carrie Garrison Laney exposes the signatures from the past.
This is an event. This is an unusual event.
She's a geologist with Washington Sea Grant, working with the University of Washington.
And there's another sand layer comparable in size to the one above it.
What is gray is what stands out.
Here, there's definitely organic material, but there's also a lot of mud and silt.
Sand pushed in by large waves, covered up by more mud.
This one has a radiocarbon date about 600 years old. And this one has a radiocarbon date that suggests it's from 1700.
And it's all generated from a 600-mile-long fault running off the Pacific coast from Cape Mendocino, California, past Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, Canada. The fault runs along a boundary of crustal plates making up the ocean floor that are, for now, locked to the western edge of the North American plate. Those plates pushing against each other, driving to the northeast and up. And when they release, all hell breaks loose. The next one likely to rank as one of the world's biggest earthquakes, a magnitude 9 plus. Our earthquake history runs deep, and as Garrison Laney goes back further in time taking core samples, you can see the pattern continue.
Marsh, big disturbance event. Normal marsh, disturbance event. Normal marsh, another disturbance event. There's actually 9 or 10 layers.
It's a record dating back nearly 2,000 years. It all promises there will be more violence to disrupt the peace, more ghost forest. A warning for all of us to prepare. On Washington's coast, Glenn Farley, King 5 News.
So, of course, they didn't tell me about any of this before they offered me the job up here. So I was one of those that showed up not having a lot of knowledge of Cascadia prior to being here. And if I can get my slides to advance, there we go. So how the Japan has excellent record keeping. So that January date and the specific time they actually got by knowing the time that a tsunami arrived in Japan, that they were unable to connect to any other known events. Like he mentioned, there's a correlation with other evidence. One of the interesting ones that's mentioned in one of the other videos that's on the handout that I'm not going to read tonight or watch tonight is that The Native Americans told stories about it, but of course we just didn't have a lot of detail to know exactly when that was. So some things to keep in mind about when the last happened up here in the Pacific Northwest. The population was entirely in Native American. There was little, if any, European settlement yet. Some of their oral history that gets passed down talks about the chaos that's created by it. So consequently, you know, we didn't have a lot of reminders. Unlike a lot of other areas, we don't see earthquakes on a regular basis, so we weren't thought of as a earthquake prone area. When you think about even the 1900s, you know, a little over 100 years ago, it's hard to remember that San Francisco earthquake was only 114 years ago, 1906. The science that started to explain a lot about the earthquakes and allowed us to understand them isn't even 60 years old. In the interest of time, I'm not going to show the video, but it's a very interesting one that a geology professor does, about 15 minutes long. That's very interesting to have his perspective on it. So you might want to take a look at that afterwards. We generally don't do well in preparing for events that we haven't experienced. You know, that was one of the major battles in getting smoke detectors to be common for everybody's home. You know, we think it'll happen to somebody else, but unless we've experienced, we're not great at preparing for things. For those of us that live in the West, I'm sure you've all stood in an older town where there's a plaque on the side of the building that talks about how many times the community was ravaged by fire or burned to the ground. You know, the downtown area burned before they rebuilt in brick. And that just sort of, you know, is the epitome of why we do so well with that. One of the other challenges that we face is that the fact that a lot of the major infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest was constructed before we actually understood the earthquake risk. There's a lot of high density population that's situated in areas that are subject to liquefaction. So what could we expect? I'm a big believer in looking at the history. Japan's a country with a very long history and a long history of earthquakes. Hence, they're considered one of the most prepared countries, and yet they still suffered significant casualties from the 2011 quake. Most of the damage and loss of life was not as a result of the shaking, as most of the buildings survived, but were lost to the ensuing tsunami. And there's just a few of the scenes from that. And just like the Cascadia subduction zone, theirs was also a 9.1 subduction zone megathrust earthquake that occurred offshore. Another one that did not get a lot of press in our world, but was significant, was Chile. Also had a subduction zone type earthquake in 2010, the year before. Relatively few fatalities, but it had a significant impact on the southern portion of the country. The USGS and Red Cross did a report on the quake that's really good reading. The report that I read listed 4 main reasons for the lower loss of life. First was very strong building codes and really strict enforcement. Chilean law requires that builders to be accountable for losses in a building for 10 years after construction. Second was the limited number of fires. They attribute that likely to the fact the power grid shut off early in the shaking, so there wasn't power and sparking and such as the hazard were exposed. And third was the local emergency response was very effective. They had close coordination between emergency management, fire, and police. And fourth was the high level of knowledge about earthquakes and tsunamis by the population that helped them respond appropriately after the event. So the maps, I'm going to show you some maps here. These, the ones that I have are from our latest HAZUS run. There's a description of HAZUS on the slide. It's computer modeling and shows us the expected fatalities and injuries from the quake. It's important as we look at these to remember that these are specific or strictly estimates of the earthquake damage and does not include the tsunami risk. The planning folks are in the process of updating that, the tsunami numbers, but we'll talk about those in a minute. And the other thing to keep in mind is it only reflects the data for the initial quake. There will be aftershocks, and depending upon the severity and the location of those, that will also cause casualties. So for Oregon, we're talking about 1,700 injuries from the quake is the estimates. But from the shaking, we can expect about 3,300 fatalities. So that's the estimates that they're getting from the computer modeling. In Washington, it's about 1,100 injuries. And a little over 2,200 fatalities. And again, this is only based on the immediate effects from the first earthquake and not necessarily the aftershocks. I don't have a slide on it, but the numbers for the tsunami for both Washington and Oregon, the last estimate I heard, it is actually inverse. So unlike the earthquake where we see more fatalities and fewer injuries, the tsunami is the opposite, where there'll be many more fatalities and fewer injuries. So the latest numbers I have were approximately like they're estimating 4,000 injuries between the two states and estimating somewhere around 13,000 fatalities. As we saw with the Japan event, the biggest loss of life was due to the tsunamis. Oh, and there's the numbers. I did put that in there. So we're going to watch one last video here, and talks about the tsunami risk in Seaside, Oregon. And if I can get the link to work here. Oh.
Wyoming, Sacramento, California.
So the beaches are not. It's a Tuesday on the Oregon coast. This is the tourist town of Seaside. It's a weekday, so the beaches are not nearly as packed as they would be on the weekend, but there's still crowds, and the main drag through town still bustles with visitors.
I'm from Wyoming, Sacramento, California.
Longview, Washington.
This is a typical day in the Oregon coastal town, but geologists will tell you there will be one day, perhaps in the not-so-distant future, that will turn all this upside down.
So the whole town will turn into a giant lake full of floating houses and debris and floating cars.
Tom Horning, a geologist of over 30 years and a Seaside City Councilor, says that day will come when the Cascadia subduction zone, a fault about 70 miles offshore, ruptures in a catastrophic magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake. As one section of the earth plunges below another, the seafloor will instantaneously lift up, the ocean above will bulge, sending a massive wave barreling toward the west coast. At first, from the beach here in Seaside, it will appear as if the tide is going out, but way too fast. Then, about 15 to 20 minutes later, the leading edge of the wave will hit the beach. At 25 minutes, the water will start flooding over the promenade here and pouring down the city's streets. At about that same time, a massive foaming breaker about a mile out will be racing in. That's the crest of the tsunami. When it comes on shore, it will be anywhere from 25 to 55 feet above the sand here, possibly even higher.
And it'll come right up and over everything, and it'll go up into the 3rd and 4th floor of some of these motels.
Those on the top floors of the newer buildings, the ones constructed to withstand both an earthquake and tsunami, might be safe as they watch the waves swallow the town behind them.
Well, the water would cover all of the buildings out here. Most of the city would be underwater for at least a little while.
But hopefully by that time, people in town will have evacuated to higher ground if they happen to see these evacuation signs, which point which way to go.
This little decal on the road here is a tsunami evacuation sign, telling you to go that direction towards the hills.
Still, they'll have to move pretty quickly once the shaking of the massive quake stops.
You have 20 to 25 minutes to get to safety.
Driving to safety will be nearly impossible as fleeing drivers jam up the roads. The best option will be walking. Some will run. In order to get to a safe area, folks will have to cross one of 11 bridges, but according to some engineers, only 4 will remain intact following the quake. When it's all over, about 90% of the homes in town will be destroyed, but there will be a much greater cost.
Well, if it happened during the summer on a busy weekend in the town that fills up with 40,000 people, the fatality rates are going to be maybe 60%. That's 24,000 people.
And experts tell us this is not a worst case scenario. This would be more of a typical scenario, one the city of Seaside is planning for.
Well, this is one of 4 bridges that the city has replaced already with earthquake-proof structures.
In addition to the 4 new earthquake-proof bridges,
Well, this is the site for the new school district school facilities.
a brand new high school is being built well out of the inundation zone. A water tank will go in above it so the campus will have much needed drinking water following the quake.
Thousands of people may need to come up here.
They are all improvements coastal cities like Seaside are making almost entirely on their own, doing what they can to make sure their residents and visitors will be able to make it to safety. Not if, but when the tsunami strikes. So you're saying it could happen at any time?
Yeah, it could happen at any time, or it may not happen for 500 years.
So, one of the considerations is the fact that along the coast, there's going to be communities where the timing just to get out of those areas is a major challenge. You can see in Washington, we've got a couple of those areas, particularly the long one. Oh yeah, you can see my mouse. You can see how far they've got to travel, and it's not physically possible, even if everybody's able to drive in a straight line and nobody jams up the road or causes any problems, to make it out of there before the tsunami will overtake them. So big issues with that. The other thing keep in mind is the fact that being coastal areas, they're like they mentioned in the video, they're going to attract a large number of visitors who are not likely going to be familiar with the tsunami risk. I've got a couple of quick little silent videos that we'll look at here that demonstrate the tsunami inundation expectation here in Washington State. And like I said, these are silent. So you can see there in less than 30 minutes, a big portion of the coast was impacted by that. And then you'll also have the follow-on. So you can see Seattle just getting now at a little over an hour. And it will continue to impact areas throughout the Puget Sound. And the other thing to keep in mind is you might have noticed that the tsunami also starts to go the other direction, as there'll be other impacts throughout the Pacific. It won't be just a North American event when that transpires. So the Washington models are available at the link on the slide there, and that is in the handout. One of the efforts that's going on is in some of those areas is to create vertical evacuation refuges. In March, FEMA provided funding as part of a pre-disaster mitigation grant to assist with the cost of one of those for the Shoalwater Bay tribe that's out on the coast there. These towers obviously need to be extremely well anchored and high enough to escape the incoming tsunami waves. Vertical towers were one of the things that were cited in saving thousands of lives in the 2011 Japan earthquake. It's something that's relatively new here in North America. Transportation is going to be one of the critical elements that will be heavily impacted by the earthquake. The vast majority of the damage will be west of the Cascade Mountains. The Cascades themselves create problems in that there's a limited number of mountain passes. If the quake were to occur during the winter, there'd only be 2 passes in Washington that are normally kept open. Of course, that'll create a huge bottleneck in bringing emergency personnel, supplies, and equipment into the area, and likewise trying to evacuate people from the stricken areas. As I mentioned earlier, the Cascadia subduction zone wasn't recognized until recently. Much of the transportation infrastructure predates that and was not built to survive an earthquake. I-5, which is the major north-south route between the areas, is likely to experience significant damage and serves a large portion of the population, and that was only built in the late 60s. The good news is the improvements are ongoing. Both Washington and Oregon are well aware of those limitations and are routinely making improvements to improve the survivability of those routes. Here in Washington, they continue to improve I-5 corridor, where they're not only replacing bridges, but they've been strengthening the support structures. But of course, all that's going to take time and money, so it won't all be done for a while. If anybody participated or was able to catch the presentations from the Communications Academy held here in the Pacific Northwest in April, there was an excellent presentation by Jason Bierman of Snohomish County Emergency Management. In it, he discusses the fact that even on the mainland, disasters create islands. They may not be surrounded by water, but when transportation and communications fail, you'll create islands that will need to rely on their local resources. Restoration of access could take a considerable amount of time, and those failures will likely create islands that did not respect jurisdictional boundaries and will require coordination between jurisdictions. All of this will require thinking and planning around those islands rather than the conventional thinking about jurisdictions. I recommend if you have the opportunity, take a look at the slides from the Com Academy presentation, and likewise that link's on the handout. So communications, that's why I suspect most of you are here. I'm a big believer in looking at the history to plan our future. Unfortunately, the specific impacts from earthquakes to communications facilities is not something that's regularly documented very well, at least that I've been able to find. Excuse me. Modeling says that there's a significant amount of the communications infrastructure that will experience moderate to severe damage, and we'll talk about some of the details of that here in a moment. One of the things to keep in mind is things are improving. The federal government's pushed literally billions of dollars into improving the reliability and the resilience of public safety systems over the last 20 years. The standards involved in communications infrastructure have seen significant emphasis on addressing hazards. Over the years, the tower standards have addressed many issues, and newer towers will be much more resilient. The site construction standards have not only become more universal, but continue to evolve. Motorola's R56 standard's been around for a while. In 2019, APCO published the ANSI APCO Public Safety grade site hardening requirements. And the first on those list of considerations they include in that is seismic events. So it's getting a lot more attention. A lot of the growth in communication systems has been recent. You think about the explosion of cell towers going in and stuff. So a lot of them have been built to these new standards. And awareness of the earthquake risk has led to ensuring that new towers are built to handle those possible quakes. As the technology has evolved, we're moving away from the hub and spoke networks where where there might be a single point of failure to one where there's many more redundant, diverse routes that are available. One of the big things to remember is the private communication structures. The vast majority of it is privately owned. But despite some of the assumptions that folks throw out there that it will all fail, you've got to keep in mind that those providers don't operate in a vacuum either. They want to protect their investment and make it as resilient as possible within the budget constraints they have. The vendors have been planning for a Cascadia event and improving their systems. They've identified those cable routes that are tied to bridges that may fail, created redundant routes. Many of those bridges continue to be strengthened by the transportation authorities and are more likely to survive. Power is one of our big ones. It's the Achilles heel of communications. Often in the large disasters that we see, the outages are often due to the lack of available power rather than the actual damage to the facilities. Nashville bombing is a good example. The equipment ran inside the building till the battery power ran out. The on-site emergency generators were unable to supply power, and due to some limitations in being able to access the site, they were delayed in connecting generators that were brought to the scene. It's likely some communications will be present immediately after the quake, but we'd likely to see additional outages occur in the hours, days, and even weeks after the event as those backup power sources fail or run out of fuel. Those emergency generators typically have a limited amount of fuel, and at some point they're also going to need maintenance. Backhaul is the connection between those remote sites and the switching centers in the outside world. Many of the towers and communications infrastructure in an area may survive the quake, but without that connection to the switching centers, they won't be able to process calls. There may be a high priority in restoring service to certain types of facilities, but the repair of the telephone pole in front of a critical building will do little if the connections near the switching office are broken. Repair will often follow the power restoration. The original model of power being supplied to your landline phone coming from the telephone central office is mostly a thing of the past. Fewer and fewer landline phones exist, and most are relying on neighborhood multiplexing gear that requires local power. Likewise, cable TV and internet is similar, requires local power for amplifiers and distribution equipment. Here's some examples of neighborhood distribution points. They usually contain a small backup power system inside the cabinet, but they're unlikely to run more than a half day or so. Most are configured for the connection of an external portable generator, but there'll be thousands of these types of sites needing generators, and those generators will need fuel and security. So many of the outages that we expect will be in that last mile in getting the services to the residents. Another consideration is that if there is no power available, the residents may not be able to take advantage of the service if it's there. Here's an example from back in January when a windstorm took out the power near my home. I had power, but the internet was out for a few hours until the cable company was able to plug the nearby equipment into a portable generator. You can see their solution there where they chained the generator to a power pole. So FEMA's role in a Cascadia event is to support the state and local response efforts. The federal government will not be coming in to take over, but rather to support the state's management of the event. FEMA Region 10 is in the process of updating our Cascadia subduction zone response plan. It's important to know that there's two different efforts underway currently. There's the actual response plan, and then there's also the planning for a national level exercise called Cascadia Rising, scheduled for June of 2022, almost exactly a year from now. The exercise will help to test the plan. The plan's distinct and is what will be referred to when the event actually happens. Planning for the exercise is also underway, and so that leads to confusion about the efforts. A large portion of the response plan effort this year is focusing on transportation and logistics. For ESF2, there's not a lot of changes expected other than adding some of those logistics and transportation details that are not in the current plan. Just very briefly, for those that may not be familiar with Emergency Support Function 2, I recently did a webinar, and that's available on the Region 10 Regional Emergency Communications Coordination Working Group website. We refer to that as the RECWIG. The link's on the handout there. And I'll do just a real quick run through of the functions during the response phase of the disaster. One of the things keep in mind is operational communications is a shared responsibility. ESF2 needs to provide the coordination to ensure that the incoming responders have communications, but this is also a responsibility of the normal communications unit leader under the logistics section. Within disaster response framework, it's a little bit muddied, and that's one area I personally feel needs to be addressed for improvement in making those distinctions a little bit clearer. Information is king. Sharing the situational picture with all the partners, both government and private, will allow everyone to be a whole lot more effective. Coordination is key. A simple example of that at the state or local level, if you have a communication site and all the users can coordinate the delivery of fuel for backup generators for multiple buildings, you not only increase the efficiency, but you'll likely get a higher priority in getting that fuel delivery. Coordination between emergency support functions also increases efficiencies. If debris is going to be cleared from a route and the power utilities are going to work on restoration, it makes sense for the communications vendors to work with that group and follow shortly behind them. They'll be able to do their restoration. ESF2 can help facilitate and coordinate the industry response to a large-scale event like this. There will not be enough resources. We know that. Coordinating the industry response can help to spread out those resources rather than having, say, all three cellular vendors trying to fill the need in the same geographic area. And of course, reporting is key. Senior leaders will need to be able to understand the situation and the requirements in order to be able to allocate and prioritize the resources. For ESF2, we're reporting along the 5 components that make up the communications lifeline. Briefly, I'll mention the communications flow, the information volume and the flow before we talk about channels. Resources should always come from the lowest levels first. That'll always provide the quickest response. For example, if your community needs an extra fire truck, they should use the extra one at your fire station first. If it doesn't start, then of course they'd look to their neighbors that they may have an agreement with. Then if that didn't meet the need, they could probably request it from the county or a similar jurisdiction. If the county was unable to find enough, then they would make a request to the state. And the state may look to its neighbors and seek help through a process called EMAC, the Emergency Mutual Aid Compact. And then if they needed, if they weren't able to fill it that way, then they'd reach out to the federal government. The information flow when we're in a disaster scenario needs to follow the same paths. Normally, the state will not be communicating directly with individual neighborhood associations, nor would FEMA be accepting requests direct from each city. In order to receive a federal disaster declaration, the governor of the state has to make the request of the President of the United States. There's a lot of other details in that process that we're not going to go into. States usually have similar laws or process within the state, and there is one exception to that. The recognized Native American tribes have the ability to either request a declaration direct from the federal government, or they can elect to process the request for assistance through the state. So even though it's maybe a federal disaster, the role of amateur radio will still be mostly at the local and state level. Disasters are local. We federally support them, state managed and locally executed. Even though FEMA is unlikely to call on the amateurs directly, they're very important to building a resilient nation that's prepared for disasters. Some of the activities we support to accomplish that at the regional level here in Region 10 include the 60-meter interoperability net each month. Each FEMA has a regional emergency communications coordination working group that amateurs are more than welcome to participate in. Region 10 has quarterly RECWIG meetings. Like most meetings nowadays, they've been virtual due to COVID, but even when we return to the in-person meetings, we'll continue to have a virtual presence. Our next meeting will also be virtual. It'll be on August 4th, and it'll be include a communications exercise on the 5th that's going to be HF focused. Also, our Region 10 RECWIG publishes a newsletter twice a month called The Tidbits. The address to request more info will be on the closing slide of the presentation, and it's in the handout. So then on top of all this, we have Cascadia Rising 2022. It's a distinct effort from the plan. There will be, one of its purposes will be to test parts of the Cascadia plan. Some of the outcomes from this exercise will likely be incorporated into future revisions of the plan. The primary focus is Oregon and Washington, and some involvement in Idaho. It's important to know that each jurisdiction decides if they want to participate, at what level, and any local injects that they would like to include. We often refer to their participation in the exercise as play. For next year's exercise, there will not be a region-wide communications outage. That does not preclude the state or local jurisdictions from including communications injects. There's been a bit of confusion over that, and just want to be clear, but it's up to the state or the local jurisdictions to decide that they want to have a communications issue in there. But we're not going to do it across the entire exercise at once on a region-wide basis. Other things to note about the 2022 exercise, it'll be a hot start. So it's starting on the basis that the earthquake already occurred, and we're at the 96-hour point. So we're starting at the beginning of day 5 after the quake has occurred. Because it involves a lot of paid professional personnel, it runs Monday through Friday on an 8-hour day. That helps to minimize the overtime costs for agencies to participate. Any of the activities that are supposed to happen overnight will all be simulated. There's nothing that precludes local groups from working with their jurisdiction to include a communications inject during the event. One of the ones that I've recommended to a couple groups, amateur groups that want to be involved, is to think about having their amateur communications exercise the weekend preceding it. Just like after in that first 96 hours, they can move traffic that way and do a lot of it when they'll have more folks available. The other thing to be aware of is also include some ancillary activities. For example, the Coast Guard is doing a major national spill exercise as part of the event. They'll be doing that out in the Puget Sound. So if you're in the Pacific Northwest, you need to get prepared. One of the things that was learned from the 2016 exercise was the fact that the 72 hours of preparedness for individuals have been recommended for years was not going to be anywhere near adequate. Damage would be too significant to expect to be able to get any assistance into the area inside that time frame. So the mantra now is 2 weeks ready. That's the recommendation that's made to folks. Be prepared to take care of yourselves for up to 2 weeks before assistance arrives. FEMA has several great individual and community preparedness programs. Earlier I showed the slide about the islands that will be created when the earthquake occurs. Only the resources that are available within your island will be there. So it's a good time to think about working with your neighbors and community to build a CERT capability, might improve your outcome. Likewise, the amateur community needs to interface with CERT whenever possible. If you expect to operate your communications equipment, you also need to think and plan for prepare not just for the 2 weeks ready, but longer. If you're in a rural area, it could be months before the power comes back. Fuel's obviously going to be very difficult to obtain, especially for the first several weeks. Thanks for the participation. There's the link for the Region 10 email address. If you'd like to get added to the list, just drop a note there. And I guess we'll start to work on questions.
Up here, but there's a ton of them in the chat area. Barry, you want to take that?
Yeah, are you talking to me, KI6BKP?
No, Barry,
KB1
PA. And he doesn't appear to be there. Okay.
I'm here.
All right, take it away. You want to start with the chat questions?
Sure. This is from Dennis in Oregon, KI7CUS. The facilities mentioned, are they what is estimated at the time of the quake only, or do they include deaths days later?
So I'm sorry, you were asking about the injuries and fatalities? Is that what? Okay. So yeah, that's just the initial quake. So that's the initial quake. There will be, additional fatalities from folks that get seriously injured that aren't able to get adequate treatment. There'll probably likely be additional injuries and fatalities that will occur due to the aftershocks. And, like a lot of this major of a quake, the aftershocks are going to go on for months afterwards. We saw that in Japan.
Lloyd, can I ask you that down your screen, you got your screen still being shared?
Oh, sure.
Approximately how far south do you think the effects of the quake will travel?
The fault itself runs into Northern California. So there's some of those areas around Eureka and that Northern California area that definitely will be impacted by it directly. I haven't really seen anything as far as how far south the tsunami would affect the coast there in California. So that's one I don't have an answer to.
Okay. Jim Price says, as far south as Cape Mendocino in Northern California, the tsunami would travel farther like it did from the Alaskan earthquake that affected Crescent City, California, and San Francisco Bay. So the California people have to be ready, just like everyone else.
There will be impact in, places like Hawaii and islands in the Pacific and stuff from it also.
Okay. The Oscar from Puerto Rico wants to know how amateur radio can help in this kind of a catastrophe, and what mode of communications may the agencies prefer, for example, DMR, etc.?
It's like I've been trying to stress, it's a local thing where amateurs going to plug in. It's really going to be what works best for your locally served agencies. All those chains of communication are going to need to happen. Some of the big things I see, one of the articles I'll be writing here in a couple of months for our newsletter will be about dealing with amateur spontaneous volunteers, because even though they may not be part of your Aries group or your RACES group or anything else, we know just like when storm spotting happens, when the quake happens, they're going to be there and be available on the air, and they're going to be able to look out the window and make a report as to what's going on in the neighborhood. Well, that information is going to need to go to the local level. So folks need to be planning for that. So whatever method for that. Between the local EOCs or fire departments and such, and the county emergency management agencies, there'll need to be communication there, and amateurs may be called in to help supplement that. Likewise, between the counties and the states, to the state EOC, that would be another big role that they've filled. For the most part, we've got a fair amount of redundancy between the states and the federal government. We run an HF ALE system that's available in each state EOC. So we're not planning for a lot of amateur involvement there, but there could be the possibility of amateurs assisting with that, with providing the communications back to FEMA between the state and FEMA if needed. And that would be mostly if there was no other options out there. But that would be, as far as the FEMA response, that would be one of our first needs to try and fill, would be that communication between the state EOC and FEMA to start moving those requests.
Okay. Marty from the Los Angeles area wants to know, since most cell towers don't have even 1 day's backup battery power, how seriously can the mobile carriers be taking the risks you described?
Well, I mean, they've got to balance, you know, you think about just the sheer volume of them out there. And the other thing that I see coming too is that we're moving into 5G, where they're building all these mini cells, you know, on light poles and stuff. And you know that just because they've got to fit them inside a light pole, that those will have all minimal, if any, backup power to them. They do take the backup stuff seriously. A lot of them, you know, they're all equipped so they can roll a generator up there and stuff. A big part of it will be the scale. And the other thing, and keep in mind, like I mentioned in the slides, is a lot of the issue is going to be the backhaul. It really doesn't matter if out on the coast the cell sites have power or not. If there's no connection back to the outside world, you know, running a generator out there isn't going to accomplish anything if they don't have that connection back to the switching center. So it's all, you know, as we move along, it's all interconnected, and all has to be there in order to process things like cell calls. So it'd be a matter of just moving through the process, you know, as the power comes back or as you're able to restore the backhaul, then they'll be moving in the generators in order to get those sites running if they don't have power available. And the other thing to keep in mind too is they have, you know, different levels of sites. They have macro sites that have the larger coverage area, and then they have the more local sites. And so obviously, even though the coverage may not work in your living room anymore, they're going to try and light up those macro sites that provide the most coverage, you know, get the most bang for their buck right out of the gate with a generator power and stuff. And it'll be a while before they start to address the lower level sites.
Jim from California has a comment. The advantage of HF is that it doesn't require any terrestrial infrastructure, which is true. And he also says, he's from Cal OES, that they test the FNARS radio from Cal OES to FEMA Region 10 every month. And Steve from Tennessee wanted to know if FNARS is active in all Region 10. And maybe you can say what FNARS is.
So it's a FEMA National Radio System. I forget it. I think at the A is just part of national. And it's, so they have them in almost all 50 state EOCs, and each FEMA regional office and then a couple other FEMA facilities and then FEMA headquarters all have it. It's an HF ALE system that runs on government frequencies. Runs on government frequencies. And yeah, in Region 10, we actually test it twice a month. We do, I think it's the first and third Tuesdays. And that's one of the things I do since I'm there at the state EOC is go down and do that. And it's got voice capability. It has a very simple chat program in it that's fairly limited. And then it's also got phone patch capability. So you can actually, you know, if need be, if they can get the governor on some sort of a phone connection, we can connect that through and connect them back. And I'm sorry, what's the second part of that?
That was all. He just wanted to know that they test it every month. So yes, they do. And it's active in all of Region 10.
Yeah, all of Region 10, all of the FEMA regions are equipped with that. And there's even the territories out in the Pacific have it, although it's challenging making the connection to them. So.
Okay. Dan from the San Joaquin Valley wants to know, will the parameters of the Cascadia Rising 2022 include predicted degradation over time of the widespread infrastructure failures during the following 6 months or a year?
The exercise is only a week long, and it's going to be primarily, it's in the response phase. And so it will be, you know, it's not a question that I've asked, but my presumption has been it will basically be the next 5 days. So it's starting on day 5 and will basically run through day 10. And a big focus of so one of the things to keep in mind with the exercise is a lot of what's going to be the focus was what was decided by the state emergency management directors or for their agencies. And so for Washington and Oregon, some of the big focus they wanted for this exercise was energy and transportation. So a lot of the injects and a lot of the focus for it is going to be on those two topics that'll be going on. And yeah, it's one of those things where restoration from something like this will be, you know, easily a decade, if not longer. It's not something you're going to put everything back together anytime soon.
Okay. John from Oregon, thoughts on Starlink capability for this situation?
So as part of my RecWig webinars in 2 weeks here, I'll be talking about a lot of satellite things that are on the horizon. Starlink is going to be a great resource, but it's still very much in, you know, right now they're offering the beta test, and that's very much what it is. There's a lot of things out there. That's one of the things that I've put a little thought into, in that you think about some of those rural areas, and there's going to be a lot of individuals that actually that's their internet is right now. They're using geosynchronous satellites. A few of them may have things like Starlink, but they've already got the satellite link set up and running. They just need to have power. And so if they have power, those are going to be some key points that might have some communication out, even if they don't have any other resources out there. So Starlink's definitely going to be a big player. There's a lot of other vendors that are coming along in that low Earth orbit satellite market. I think, you know, 5 years from now, there's going to be a lot of capability that'll be very useful for that, which is good because everybody wants data nowadays. It will once again cause the amateur world. We're going to have to focus in on what our niche is going to be. You know, it's going to continue to get smaller and smaller.
Okay. David Melvin wants to know, is FEMA prepared to handle relayed HF radio traffic coming from Idaho, Utah, and Nevada? I don't know if you can answer that or not.
I'm not sure what he means by relay traffic.
David, you want to come on and unmute and ask your question? Maybe not. Okay. Jim Price. Okay, go ahead.
On the HF net that we exercise out here in Clallam County, we commonly talk to people in Nevada, Utah, and Idaho. During the first few days when absolutely nothing is working, information could be gotten out, but it would come over you and wind up in Idaho or Utah or Nevada, and it would come through the back door from the east. Important messages. I was just wondering how FEMA would handle messages coming from the other side.
That's a topic I haven't really put a lot of thought into. I think part of it's going back to that communication flow. It's really going to depend on what the messages are. If it's somebody in a local area trying to get word out on their situation, it would something that would need to get relayed back through to the local emergency manager. It's not something that we're going to take direct action on. So we would need to pass that back to the state, and then they would need to pass it back to like the county emergency manager. So I think
right now our EOC is in the basement of the courthouse, which probably won't stand. And there are plans to build a new EOC, so there's nothing in between that's going to be functioning as a county EOC. And the only thing that we'll have is our independent alternate emergency communication centers who can get information out. And does FEMA have a plan on how to handle information coming in from states that really aren't participating?
Yeah, that's a difficult topic that I'm not sure I necessarily have an answer for. I mean, it's one of those things where we do our best to try and get the information back to where it is, but it would definitely be a challenge.
Yeah, I remember the time when the Marines were in, Nicaragua, and they couldn't get any communications going. So one of the soldiers called the Pentagon on his cellular phone and was able to get some air support into where their location was.
Yep.
You never know.
Yeah,
yep.
Sometimes you have to pull it out of unnamed places to make it work.
Yep.
Okay, moving on.
Back to net.
Yep, thank you. Jim Price has a comment. He wonders how wise it is to push local responders to use FirstNet, which requires AT&T cell towers, especially if the cell towers aren't working.
So I'm sorry, what was the question again?
He was just making a comment on how wise is it to push local responders to use FirstNet, and that requires AT&T cell towers.
Okay, so well, I don't know that there's necessarily a push there other than the fact that FirstNet is the program that the government funded, so it's available as a resource. I mean, it's up to the individual agencies whether they see the value in that and want to elect to use it or not. And yeah, it's just like the rest of it. There's no guarantee that it's going to be there. It's one of those things where they recognize that they're serving public safety, and so they're trying to build some resilience into it. But it's going to be subject to all the faults that everybody else is. You know, I don't know. I haven't been given any information that they're doing anything significantly different as far as things like backup power and those sorts of things. I know that one of the advantages to FirstNet is it does have what they call the dedicated core. So the switching for the AT&T stuff for FirstNet happens outside of the normal AT&T stuff. So even though everybody, you know, the 40,000 people in Seaside, Oregon pick up their phones and try and make a call out, if the switching center is saturated for AT&T, the FirstNet core is distinct from that, so it would not be as impacted, other than the fact that all those first responders are probably going to be doing the same sort of things. So but there is some distinction there between the two of them. They are distinct systems in a lot of ways, but yes, they are co-located in an awful lot of actual AT&T facilities.
Okay. Steve from Tennessee, K4 CJX, gave a CSI Shares presentation to FEMA Region 10 a couple of weeks ago. He wants to know, are there specific plans to use CISA Shares WinLink during the Region 10 SF2 exercise?
Well, I'm presuming he means the SF2 exercise. If you're talking
bad typing, I'm on a new computer.
Are you talking about the August exercise, or are you talking about Cascadia Rising?
No, I'm talking about the a couple of weeks ago I gave a 30-minute
right.
I was a talk on the Shares WinLink, and they wanted that for the possibility of using it in August, because there is no communication exercise, I believe, for the main national exercise. So Region 10 was going to have their own. I know Washington's poised for it. I just wondered about, have they said anything to FEMA yet?
I'm not sure. I'm not directly involved in the planning for the August event. One of my compadres is, and I think it's going to include a lot of things. I'm sure the Shares WinLink will be included in that, but I think it'll be more at the county to state level type stuff, and maybe between states, but it will be included. You know, it will be an option that'll be exercised in August. As far as the Cascadia Rising exercise, that's something the states are more than willing to try and incorporate, but it's not something as far as at the regional level that we're going to be doing it for WinLink Shares activities.
Does that answer your question? Okay. Dan wants to know, and this is pretty, how will current resilience requirements hold up to a 55-foot tsunami? Probably not very well, I would assume.
Yeah, the coastal areas are going to take the brunt of it, you know, just like we saw in Japan when, you know, everybody saw the video and has seen all that. You know, a lot of that infrastructure is just going to be wiped out. One of the other big challenges when you think about those rural areas is they are rural, and so a lot of the transportation routes in, you know, are one way in and out, or, you know, there's maybe you can come from the north along the coast, or you can come from the south along the coast. So if the coast gets wiped out, even if they are up high enough that they avoid the tsunami, getting things in and out to them is going to be extremely difficult. And likewise, restoration for communications is going to be difficult, because a lot of communications infrastructure, takes the easy way. It follows the railroad routes, it follows the roadways, because the easements and stuff are there. So getting a lot of those coastal areas, even if they escape the tsunami, is going to be a very significant challenge in the restoration process. And yeah, it's going to require a lot of helicopter support for just getting the basic life-sustaining water and food out to folks, and then likewise communications. It's going to be one of those that's going to have to follow in, and it's going to be extremely limited for quite a while.
Okay, and then there's some other comments that people can read in the chat later, but mostly the communications have to go through the respective states, and then the states will communicate with FEMA. So that's something that's fairly obvious to the people that do stuff with this. So, but for areas and stuff, all of the comments will go through the states, and then the states will make the communications pass to FEMA, and then hopefully they'll be able to get some help. And Dan will be able to make plans in Idaho for beachfront property. And that's all the comments and questions from the chat. So I guess if anyone wants to raise their hand.
Yeah, Larry's KI6BKP got his hand up. Go ahead, Larry.
Oh.
Yeah, like you said, FEMA works on information. And one thing I'd like to make note of is that a lot of the ham radio operators can provide the infrastructure information to your local people to push it up through the system. A lot of them just concentrate on whoever they have their MOU with. And it's something to stress that we're the boots on the ground and the eyesight and the ears. And to work it up the ladder, we're going to be able to say, yeah, that bridge is out. Because in my case, we had a drill here, or an actual incident here, and everybody was saying, oh, the roads are clear, anybody can go here. And the person who was saying that was sitting in a desk in Sacramento. So, we got the word out, and that went up the ladder. So that's something I think a lot of these guys are kind of scratching their heads on what we can do. And that's one of the big things is intelligence.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, though, that a lot of that's going to need to live at the state level, because it's going to be the state folks that are going to be prioritizing where a lot of the resources go. Part of the a meeting I sat in on a couple days ago, they were talking about the intermediate force forwarding plan for what gets flown in on each day as the things evolve and stuff. And fairly early on that is a lot of the Corps of Engineer folks to come in to help assist with doing the engineering inspections of structures and determining how safe some of those things are, and also looking at like airport facilities and such, seeing what's going to take to get those reopened to continue to move things in. So a lot of that information's there. It's going to be needed. A lot of it's going to be, especially as we get past the first few days, is going to be more of the engineering stuff of what they truly can trust and stuff. But yeah, a lot of that very early initial information, just looking out the window and seeing what's going on in the neighborhood and being able to report a lot of that stuff, is what the local folks are going to need to know, so they can help start to prioritize where they're going to be sending resources. One comment about the whole resource process to mention is one of the things most people don't realize is the fact that a lot of most disasters, not all of them, but most of them are a cost share arrangement. So whenever a resource is requested by a state, they have a 25% responsibility on the bill. So that's part of the reason why resource requests don't flow from like the county level to FEMA, because the state's on the hook for 25% of that cost. So they have to sign off on everything that they request from the federal government. So there's some reasons behind a lot of that whole process, and that's just one of them. Occasionally, like with COVID, the president can decide to waive the state cost share, and in a really major one that would typically happen. But even at that point, the state still has a say on what resources they request from the federal government.
It's all part of the chain of command.
Yep.
And the U.S. Geological Survey, in case anybody doesn't know about it, has this thing called Did You Feel It? on the amateur WinLink system in Southern California in order to better track earthquake effects. In case anyone wants to look that up, there's all kinds of information on Did You Feel It online. So.
Yep, and I don't think it's limited to just Southern California. Right. That's available nationwide, and so anybody can start to put those reports in, and they're integrating WinLink into that. So that's will be a good backup for people to be able to report things.
It's a worldwide process for both amateur and non-amateur spectrum, and it is happening that way.
Okay, great. It's a resource we should all take advantage of. Okay, that's all the questions in chat. Any more hands?
Yes, I just raised my hand.
Okay.
Okay. What I'm looking at here. Anyway, Lloyd, could you, for all of us to be on the same page, can you give us a pecking order type thing? Let's say, give us, it doesn't matter the state. Pick a state, Arizona, whatever, has a major catastrophe. FEMA is called into the picture. State is obviously already in there, and so is the county by that time. Who is in charge of what? Who's calling the shots on this thing?
So it's ultimately up to the states. The federal government doesn't have the ability to override the state, but the thing that we bring to bear is just the resources that come in. You know, like we'll provide a lot of guidance to the state as to what we can do, and it can, when you get into the politics, it could get down to, the governor wants something done this way, and the federal government saying, well, that's not the way it's going to happen. And so, you get into those sort of gray areas. But the bottom line is it's state managed, and that's why I put it in the slide there a couple of times. It's locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. So there's really, as far as my knowledge, within the Stafford Disaster Act, there's no situations where the federal government would actually take it over per se. For lack of direction from a state, they might be providing a lot of resources. And a lot of times, a lot of the direction that comes from the governors are, we need help. We've got all these rescues that need to be done, those sorts of things. And then a Coast Guard unit will move in with helicopters and such, and they'll be doing a lot of their own decision making on prioritizing and some of that, but it will still be in coordination with the state. So it's always the state and the state governor that's typically is going to be the ultimate word in any given scenario, unless it was something that was truly a nationwide thing. But even like you saw with COVID, you saw all the different directions different governors went on how their response happened and how things happened inside of their state.
Okay, I'd like to follow up with that. I'm going to use Boise, Idaho as an example. In Boise, we have the governor, where the governor lives and works. It's the capital city. It's where FEMA is. It's where our EOC is. I'm sorry, state EOC is. It's where all of our National Guard is. Everything's in one spot. I don't know what it would be, but given that scenario, if Boise was out of the picture, how does FEMA handle that?
So there's a whole group within FEMA that does continuity of government planning, and those were the folks that back when I don't know, quite a while back, did all the secret stuff. They're the ones that were involved in some of the sheltering of like the national leaders and stuff there around DC and that area for getting building the underground bunkers and things back there and that sort of thing. But that whole continuity of government concept, that there still needs to be some leadership regardless of what happens. Every state has a continuity of government plan. So they designate within their, usually a lot of times it's within their state constitution, the succession of, if the governor, if the bomb goes off and at the Capitol and, half of the legislature and the governor and the lieutenant governor are gone, who it falls to and that sort of thing. So, and then there's also plans for where they would reestablish. like in Washington, if something were to happen to where, we had a Cascadia event, one of their options is to go to a place like Spokane and set up the state government to operate out of there from the folks that are available and that sort of thing. And they have plans in place to get those people evacuated, those key leadership folks, to somewhere else in the state where that can happen. So that, as far as I'm aware of, that exists for most every state. But it's one of those things, how prepared the state is for that, and how extent their plan is. It's still a state responsibility for the state government.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, Dan from California wants to know if FEMA authorizes assignments of the federal all hazards type 1 IMTs if the state IMT resources are exhausted or expended.
I'm sorry, the state
all hazard type 1 IMT? If all the state IMT resources are exhausted or expended, that would be up to the government, right? The governor?
Well, yeah, the state would put in the request if they said we have no incident management teams. And as example, I've been working completely unrelated to communications, just being the liaison officer for FEMA at the state EOC for COVID for a while. We had a lot of requests, especially early on, where they were putting in requests for specific resources out of IMT. So like early on, we were tapping a lot of the all hazards and fire folks for the public information officer or the information officer roles. So we were pulling folks, the state said, our staffing is thin in this area. This is an area where we need assistance. And so they put in the resource request to FEMA, and we found the resources within the fire world and the all hazard world to fill those needs. So yeah, if the state said we need an incident management team, we would send that one of the federal incident management teams in. And I think we did that in a few instances around the country.
Did that answer your question, Dan?
Yeah, it did. It was getting a little confused. I confuse easily, so that's the reason for that question.
Okay. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else. Okay,
Dan also has his hand up. Did you mean to keep your hand still up?
No, I thought we changed modalities. I'll pull my hand down. Oh,
okay.
Wait a minute. Somebody did. There you go.
You're good.
Okay, go on there, Barry.
That's all. We're looking for more hands. Everyone says thank you for a great presentation and sharing the information.
It has been a great presentation.
Yeah, and Dan, if Cascadia happens, Idaho's going to become a very busy place because it's going to be one of the significant staging locations for moving a lot of material through and, flying. It'll be one of those intermediate points where a lot of stuff will fly there and stage a bit until they get moved out into the field. So.
Well, Lloyd, if that happens, get a hold of me very fast because I have a cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains. I'm sure it's high enough up, it won't be affected, and I got a spare room that you can take over.
Perfect.
And it's got solar power and satellite internet.
There you go.
Okay, is there anything else out there, folks? This has been a great presentation.
I think so, yes.
One last question. Do we just have to sign up for the email address you gave us earlier if we want to be kept informed of the planning for Cascadia Rising?
Yeah, if you get on the list for the Tidbits newsletter, the communications related things related to Cascadia Rising will definitely be things that appear in there. And something that I'm starting, I wrote an article, we're building momentum towards Cascadia Rising. We'll probably be doing like monthly or maybe every other month between now and then. And it'll just be some general articles of smaller exercise or thoughts, people preparedness, how they can improve their readiness and be doing that. The first one that I wrote was on backup power and thinking in terms of having to operate for weeks rather than our typical scenario where, you run maybe 10, 12 hours until the power comes back on, and how that affects places like dispatch centers and those sorts of things. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be writing one about how to, at least some thinking points for planning for how you would deal with spontaneous volunteers, within the ham community. And not only just the hams, but you also have to think about the other radio systems that are out there. You think about all the garbage trucks that are roaming around on any given day, and the fact that they typically have two-way radios, and those types of folks, and how can you gather information from those people, what mechanisms are in place to accomplish that sort of thing. So there'll be a series of articles like that will be in the tidbits as we move along also.
Very good. I think everybody ought to take a point in looking at that.
And Dan, you're going to mail these slides out and the presentation out to everybody, correct?
I will, and also there's a sheet